Thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure, as always, to be in Vermont. Although, come on, what is with this weather? You know, I would like today to tell you a really depressing story. But I'm going to start somewhere that I hope ends up in a good place. Starts in a good place and ends in a good place. And that is here. So I'm supposed to be talking about the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. And where that whole story really starts is here in the Civil War with Abraham Lincoln, who rededicates America to the idea of equality of opportunity. That, as he said in the Gettysburg Address, we're coming up on the anniversary of that, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That's pretty heady stuff, and there's an awful lot of people who fought for that. At the end of the day, more than 300,000 American veterans gave their lives or were injured in that cause, and they believed that they were fighting for the idea that man in that case, but that every man had a right to a say in his government. And that concept, the idea that government should not belong to a very few, but should in fact belong to everybody, was really the motivating factor by the end of the Civil War. Which is great, and we can all go home right now. Except what does that actually mean? Like, what does it mean for everybody to have a voice in their government? Indians? Like, what about Indians? You know, in the middle of the 19th century, after the Civil War, these are names that everybody would have known. Quanah Parker, who is going to be leading the Comanche, the last great leader of the Comanche Nation, Geronimo, an Apache, and Sitting Bull, who is a Lakota, who is going to be leading the Plains Indians Wars in about a decade. Should they have a say in American society? That's not clear. What about African American men? You know, they gave in higher proportion to the Union than any other group did. Shouldn't they have a say in their society? Shouldn't they have a say in the government that is going to be determining their lives? What about women? Women had supported the United States government as in the fields, I'm sorry, people are squinting at that, and I'm thinking that is the right one, right? They supported the United States government in the fields, in the factories. They raised money for it. They bought its bonds. They gave their sons and their husbands to the cause. And they, some of them even worked in the hospitals and even as soldiers and spies. Shouldn't they have a say in American society? Shouldn't they have a say in their government? Well, certainly, white men in the North thought that they should have a say in their government. They had fought, after all, for it, and they had given their lives for it. They had thrown their money and their futures behind it. Certainly, every white man in the United States, in the North, should have a say in their government, right? What about Southern whites? Should they have a say in their government? They had literally tried to destroy the country. They had literally tried to destroy the United States of America. And yet, before the war, they were the most powerful people in it. Should they have a say or not? These are the questions that are going to be at the heart of the late 19th century. Who gets to have a say in American society? Well, at first, and I always tell my students when I do a big, broad lecture like this, this is a drive-by shooting of American history because you're getting so little, and I can talk about this more in Q&A. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, the idea that every man, and there's a caveat there about women, they are also active in the question of whether or not they should have a say, but that's really not the heart of this particular material I'm covering today. So I'm going largely to be ignoring women, but that's not because they should be ignored any more than the Indian story should be ignored, but simply because that's not what I'm talking about today. If you follow me on Twitter, you know I do very tight I try to always keep my tweet threads under 20 tweets. And invariably somebody says, well, you didn't talk about, it's like, well, if you read it, you'd see that wasn't the point today. So I can talk about that other stuff, but today I just want to talk about the idea of having a say in your government, in your society. So immediately after the Civil War, in fact, Congress and the Republican Party agree that that is central to America. And in the 14th Amendment, they, of course, declare birthright citizenship. And then in the 15th Amendment in 1870, they give the right to vote to all men. There's some caveats in that, of course, but the idea is that every man should have a say in his society, regardless of race or previous condition of servitude. So we're done, right? We can go home. Except, this is 1870. And in 1871, there's a golem in the gears. And that is that from March through May of 1871 in Paris, workers get together to take over the city of Paris because they believe their leaders have sold them out in the treaty at the end of the Franco-Prussian War. You can forget all that, but what you need to remember is that it appears to Americans that you have a picture here of a society that is being run by workers. And what they see in America is not necessarily what's happening at all in France, which I can't tell you about because I don't know anything about France. But what Americans see is they see a society that's being taken over by workers. And what they see is a society that they believe is being taken over by workers who simply want to redistribute the wealth of people who have money to themselves without doing any work. And in order to do that, they're going to destroy government. They're going to destroy society. There's all sorts of lurid stories in the American newspapers about priests' heads being cut off. And they really are going to destroy everything right down to home and family. So one of the things that shows up in the American newspapers a lot during the Paris Commune, as it is called, is the story of women who fill bottles with this newfangled stuff called petroleum. And they stick rags in it, and they light it on fire, and they toss it into the basements of buildings and blow up the buildings. This is a society that is being destroyed because you have given workers too much power. And this has particular salience in America at the time, partly because of Reconstruction, which is another long story, but also partly because 1871 is also the year that the New York Times breaks the Tweed story. In New York City, the New York municipal government is really directed by Tammany Hall, which is a Democratic boss, basically, a governmental machine overseen by the Democrats. And the way that they amass power is by giving jobs to workers, generally immigrants, who need employment when they first come to America. And in exchange for those jobs, they continue to vote the municipal Democrats back into power. So how does this compare to communism, or the Paris Commune as it was known? It compares to the two because according to the Republicans, who are appalled by Boss Tweed, the way this happens is that the government decides to, say, build a courthouse or dig a ditch or do something for the town, for the city of New York, and they contract for that. And they, of course, get wildly inflated contracts from their own guys who will give jobs to their own voters. And who pays for those wildly inflated contracts? Taxpayers. So the Boss Tweed is in the minds of many Republicans, especially in the North, deliberately redistributing wealth, hard-earned wealth, from taxpayers to workers through an active government. Do you get that? Is that you good with that? Because this is central to the rest of American history. And it doesn't actually come from here. I'm giving it to you here because New York is the center of this story. The story of it actually comes out of Reconstruction. But that construct, the idea that the Democrats and the New York municipal government are going to be creating jobs for lazy workers to stand around and, lean on their shovels, and that those contracts are going to be paid for by tax dollars, so it is therefore a redistribution of wealth, is central to the rest of American history. So what happens? This is the party of Lincoln. This is only 1871. This is 10 years after Lincoln takes office in the White House. What happens is in the election of 1872, the Republican Party abandons its concept of working for everybody, the idea that everybody has a right to a say in his government and that everybody should be able to have equality of opportunity and work his way up. And they move away from their support for workers and farmers, and in the election of 1872, they begin to work on behalf of the industrialists, the big business guys. In the wake of the problems of 1871, the Republican Party not switches, but rather than talking about how everybody should have equality of opportunity in America, they switch to saying, we need to protect the guys at the top. Because if we give too much to the guys at the bottom, they're going to be like the Paris communards. They're going to redistribute wealth. They are going to be socialists, which is the word that comes up again and again and again and again and again after 1871 in the American newspapers. That and the word communists. Everybody associates communism with 20th century world history for obvious reasons, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. But Americans start to get wigged out about communism in 1871, long before there is any kind of world communism, although that too is an interesting story. So what does it mean to support big business in the 1870s? What it means is to stop worrying about the laws that the Republican Party had passed during the Civil War to protect workers and farmers. You know, the land grant colleges, which created places like this, the Homestead Act, the contract labor law which permitted immigrants to borrow against future homesteads to come to America, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Education, the things that were designed to help people at the bottom. And rather than focusing on that whole package that they had passed during the Civil War, they tend to focus just on one thing: tariffs. And it's always great to watch people's faces when I say, now I'm going to talk about tariffs. Believe me, tariffs are actually exciting. I was once asked to give a lecture in England on tariffs. And I got there and discovered it was at 8 o'clock after dinner and drinks. I'm like, you all just hate me, right? I'm going to lecture on tariffs after you've all been drinking. It's like, you might as well just lay down on the floor now. But tariffs are actually interesting. In case you are not aware of it, this is how tariffs work. They are essentially, and this is obviously a modern slide, they are essentially a tax put on foreign products to make them more expensive than goods in America. That's it. That is not economically how they work, but politically, let's just say that's how they work, okay? So during the Civil War, as the Republican Party created income taxes and created our first national taxation, they felt that they could not force businesses and industrialists to pay those taxes without giving them some protection for their businesses to make them competitive. So they start building a tariff wall around America in 1861. And after the war, the tariff wall is just part of everything else, the income tax and all that. But by 1872, the Republican Party is doubling down on these tariff walls as the solution to everything. And they're, of course, going to abandon the income tax in 1875, and they're going to abandon some of the other things as the century goes on. But by 1872, they are absolutely wedded to the idea that the way to protect American business is not, or to protect America, is not to guarantee equality of opportunity for everybody, because you don't trust those laborers out there, but rather to protect big business. And tariff collection is huge, of course, because you literally have ships that and tariff offices that check ships coming to America, check what's in them, and collect duties, the tariffs on all the goods coming in. So this is very much a part of American society. But what it does is it permits the rising industrialists, who have their own problems, by the way, economic problems, but it permits them to collude to raise prices. So rather than simply protecting their industries, these tariffs enable them to create walls and shut out all foreign competition. And because the pool is small enough, they are able to work together to raise prices. And that means, of course, that we have the amassing of enormous amounts of wealth in the late 19th century. And regular Americans are paying much higher prices for goods than they would if there weren't tariffs. Now, we could argue about whether or not tariffs are a good thing. I'm telling you what things look like in the 19th century. And regular Americans are like, you know, forget this. We're paying extraordinary prices for things we could get way cheaper if we could buy them from Germany or France or England. And we're doing the money that this is literally a tax on regular working people to create things like this. And in exchange, legislators in the Republican Party say, you got to protect the guys at the top, or there isn't going to be anything coming down to you people. You can see where I'm going, right? The initial pools that big businessmen set up fall apart for internal reasons. And by the 1880s, they are working under something called trusts, as you know. For our purposes today, trusts are simply official ways for industries to pull together and to consolidate their holdings and, as I say, to collude prices. Until by the 1880s, you have this image in America that the trusts are literally running the American government. This is one of my favorite images from Puck. In it, you can see that literally, and these would be senators, the senators are overseeing the government. They are literally sitting above it, and the biggest trust, of course, is sugar, the sugar trust. Someday I would love to write a book about how sugar is the gateway drug to everything, but you're going to hear a little bit more about it. The Sugar Trust, but all these other trusts who literally run the Senate. They literally consider themselves the senator for the Jute Trust or the senator for the Sugar Trust, and they will talk about themselves that way in the newspapers. Well, I'm the senator for the Sugar Trust. Of course I'm going to protect the Sugar Trust. Well, you can imagine how this is going to play. By the 1880s, we have this image of the government as a plaything of J.D. Rockefeller, of somebody who is himself running an industry and who controls the government. And this is a great image for any number of reasons. Of course, you have him playing with the White House, but also with a jeweler's glass in his eye, checking whether or not that has any value. Which is a really interesting image, I think. So by 1880, you have the Republican Party branding itself as the party of emancipation, of course, and the Civil War, but also the party of protection, the party of the people who are going to protect our farms and our mines and our trades by protecting the guys at the top. Because if you protect the guys at the top, they're going to grow the economy, and that wealth is going to trickle down. Thought I'd leave that for a second. Of course, regular Americans don't buy this. Increasingly, they're losing their allegiance to this party because the party increasingly looks like it belongs to the very wealthy. And here's an image of, you know, the protection shop is the shop that is run by tariffs, and there's very little in it. The free trade shops has tons of stuff that everybody can afford. And increasingly, regular voters start to slide away from the Republican Party and switch to the Democrats. And they do so quite dramatically in the election of 1874 for the House of Representatives, but also in the election of 1885, they elect Grover Cleveland president. Grover Cleveland is an absolutely fascinating character, and I will spare you a lot of it, but he gets elected on the idea that these tariffs are creating an uber-wealthy class that is running the government. And there's nothing you can do about the trusts. There's nothing in the Constitution about trusts, because of course the founders never foresaw them. But there is something in the Constitution about tariffs. So the concept of revising the tariff, lowering the tariff, becomes an argument about who should have a say in American society. Is it just the very rich? Or should everybody get an equal opportunity to have access to resources and to rise? And in 1884, voters elect Grover Cleveland president. And he says, we got a real problem. Corporations are taking over this country, and this is not what this country is supposed to stand for. And when he gets elected, big business goes bonkers. They go nuts. They're like, this is it, because if we lose the tariff, everything comes crumbling down, because they'd convinced themselves that the only way to protect American society was to protect the people at the top, to have this tariff wall that enabled the smart guys, the guys who knew how to run the economy, the makers, to direct the rest of society. So if you're going to turn the country over to Democrats, you're in a handbasket to hell, because they're going to take down that tariff, and then all bets are off. The country's not going to keep moving forward any longer. So after the election of Cleveland in 1884, they flood the country with pro-tariff literature. They develop a new kind of financing for presidential campaigns, gives us our modern campaign financing, which is essentially John Wanamaker of the department store fame goes and hits up all his rich buddies and says, give us money or you're going to lose your tariff, and they do, and that's where we get modern campaign financing. But by 1888, you've got this increasing sense in the part of the country that the big guys have overreached, that they're taking too much and they need to be reined in. Here's a cartoon from 1888 in which you can see we've got protection here, but for capital only, and this is no longer going to fly. So in 1888, Grover Cleveland runs again on the concept of revising the tariff, not getting rid of it, but lowering it for the industries that no longer actually need it, that are doing just fine on their own. They don't need to be building those giant mansions at Newport as their summer homes, the ones where the kids have, English china in their playhouses. Enough is enough. We need to lower these tariffs and level the playing field. In fact, in 1888, Grover Cleveland wins. Most people don't know that. He wins the popular vote by about 100,000 votes. And at that point, the New York delegation and the Electoral College gets really uncomfortable, and they are open to a suggestion that perhaps the Electoral College votes of New York could be used to put somebody else in power. And in fact, the Republican wins in the Electoral College after losing the popular vote. This is how we get Benjamin Harrison. He is firmly in the pocket of the big business Republicans, and he's a staunch Methodist. No, I'm sorry, I think he's a Presbyterian. Staunch religious guy. And he says to Mark Hanna, who's his political handler, well, God has put me here, or Providence has put me here. And Mark Hanna grumbles later to somebody else, he says, Providence had nothing to do with it. A bunch of us had to approach the doors of the penitentiary to make him president. Anyway, so we have a president who is not popularly elected. And he believes that he and his party are central to the survival of the American nation. That tariff and the idea of protecting the guys at the top, you have to do that. Anybody who disagrees, those Democrats, they're socialists. They might be communists. They are the darkness. They're the mob. You can't let that happen. This is the difference between day and night, light and darkness. Either we're right or they're right, and now we are entirely in power. So what happens? They have a real problem at the heart of the Gilded Age. A small minority is ruling a vast majority. Isn't this fun? Most people don't know this history, and you should, because it's really interesting and it's kind of timely. So what do? The first thing they do is they try and stack the system in their favor. Between 1889 and 1890, the Republicans add 6 new states to the American nation. The largest acquisition of states since the original 13. It has never been equaled. We get North Dakota and South Dakota. They split the territory of Dakota in 2. We get North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming, all of which have 3 people in them. I'm sorry, I'm exaggerating. But the point is, there is no reason on the ground for these states to be admitted, as opposed to, say, Arizona and New Mexico, which have a lot of people in them. The reason these states come in, Harrison's men are very clear. The idea is to hold the Senate. Each one of these states is going to have 2 votes for forever. And also the Electoral College, because they're going to have the 2 Senate votes plus the 1 person that they're going to get for the people that they have in them. And they deliberately try and game the system, so they will never again at least lose control of the Senate and possibly the White House, so they're always going to be able to keep those tariffs high. But I just said there are no people there, right? That's okay. It's a census year, 1890. The Republicans are going to count the census. And when they do that, they're going to make sure there are enough people showing up in those states to say that they should become states. They're also going to undercount Democratic areas and overcount Republican areas. In fact, the 1890 census is so corrupt that they have to replace the guy who's in charge of it, and Republicans themselves are like, this is embarrassing. We can't go out in public anymore because this is such a bad census. They have to replace the leader of it. They finally take a census report, and do you know, that sucker burns, and they put it out with water. We do not have a copy of the 1890 census. What we have is preliminary reports of the 1890 census. And coincidence? Maybe. Nonetheless, Harrison and his men think that they're secure now, that they think that they're going to be able to do whatever they want. And what they want to do is they want to protect the country. They want that country moving forward. So they revise the tariff, just like they promised. They make it go up, not down. They make it higher to protect people at the top. And they say, you know, the economic problems we're having in America in the 1880s, the booms and the busts and all that, that's because businessmen don't feel secure. They're not sure that they're going to be able to continue to protect their businesses. You know, they need actual permanent security. So we'll give them more security, not less. And that's going to help everything. Of course, this doesn't work, but that's not part of my story. They go ahead and they raise the tariff, and they codify the idea that individual opportunity is inherent in the idea of protecting those people at the very top. And people push back against this. We get this very famous image from 1892 at Carnegie's steel plant in Homestead, and this is a set picture. And it is intended to show the difference between this guy, this one worker in the cool bowler hat, and the guy who owns all that property. Are they really equal? Is this really what America is about? Well, yes. This, according to the Republicans, is in power, running the government in the 1890s. This idea that some people should have a lot and some people should have nothing is okay, because it shows that some people are really just better than others and need their labor directed, that they can't do it on their own, and that these extreme disparities of wealth are okay, that this is the way a society moves forward. And when, of course, more and more Americans say, this is not what we signed up for, this is not our America, they take refuge in the Supreme Court. A court that most people don't know a lot about. This is the Melville Fuller Court. It is my favorite court because it is so phenomenally out to lunch on so many things, and we've forgotten it. It's been written out of the record. But they're the ones who gave us Plessy v. Ferguson, Plessy v. Ferguson, obviously. In Ray Debs, saying the government is strong enough to hunt down its individual opponents, and yet 3 months later they hand down Pollock v. Farmers Loan, in which they say, but it's not strong enough to pass an income tax. Everything they do is big business. And this is the world that they live in, a world in which there are a few people who drive society and the majority who live in conditions that were really pretty unthinkable just 30 years before. Finally, the Fuller Court gives us, in 1905, a complete reworking of Lincoln's concept of free labor. And what they decide with Lochner v. New York is that free labor really just means freedom of contract. So long as you are not literally enslaved, so long as you are able to walk away, we have equality in America. This idea is entrenched in Congress, of course, with members of the old guard, notably these two, Nelson Aldrich from Rhode Island and John D. Rockefeller. And I like to put them up here because people often don't know this lineage. This, of course, were two of the most powerful people in America, and they deliberately married their son and their daughter together, and they had a child named Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller. So we're done, right? We can all go home. The big business took over, and we've lived like that ever since, right? Of course not. From the beginning, there are protests against this. And I'm going to start here with women because women have been protesting about their own situation for a long time, but they begin to protest in very encompassing national ways. And I'm going to start here with Julia Ward Howe, because she also is upset by the Franco-Prussian War, not because of workers, but because of the slaughter that she is watching after the slaughter of the Civil War. And she says, women have to step forward as mothers to stop men from screwing up, basically is what she said. And this is where we get the beginning of the concept of mothers coming together for world peace, which quickly becomes the concept of Mother's Day. That's what Mother's Day was supposed to be. The Anna Jarvis Hallmark holiday, it was in memory of her mother, who was part of this Mother's Day. So you have women organizing and taking, as Jane Addams did, into the cities to try and ameliorate these really gross excesses of capitalism and saying this is not what American society is about. We used to be part of a web, and this matters. Immigrants are welcome here as equals to us. Also on the fringes of society, but increasingly moving toward the center, you have African-American men and women, but these are the two most powerful African-American thinkers in the 1880s and the 1890s, Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois. And Booker T. Washington, of course, right after the re-election, the 1890 crisis in the Republican Party, writes Up From Slavery and gives the Atlanta speech of 1895, in which he says, you know, there's a lot of ways to read that speech, but African Americans also have a right to rise in American society. Up From Slavery is pretty much this picture of a man rising from poverty to prominence, and we must reclaim this position in American society. And W.B. Du Bois, who is himself a Leninist, and who makes the argument that the black community needs a talented 10th, not to because the other 90% aren't worthwhile, but to grab those 90% the way Lenin wanted to and drag them toward drag them ideologically toward participating in a communist revolution. You also have people within mainstream society complaining about the excesses of the Gilded Age. You have Stephen Crane's very famous Maggie, a Girl of the Streets in 1893, right after the Republican Party has done a number of things like fixing the census and taking all the new states, saying, you know, here's a picture of a girl in society. It's a wonderful novella. He couldn't get it published for a long time because it's a nice girl who just gets beaten down until she becomes a sex worker. I can't believe my students hate it when I give spoilers, and I'm sorry about that, but you should still read the book. And then you have S.S. McClure, who is a salesman who's going door to door and looks at what people are interested in and says, Americans don't like what's going on. And he, of course, starts McClure's Magazine, which becomes one of the central places that muckrakers go to push back against this takeover of American society. And also within the Indian community, there are a lot of voices, but she is one of my favorites, Zitkála-Šá, who is a Lakota who talks about the Indian experience in America and the claims of Indians to having a say in their own lives and in American society. So there are these people pushing back, and one would think they were going nowhere if you look at the 1890s and the situation as it looks politically under the Fuller Court, for example. And yet, even within the Republican Party, there were people by 1884 who thought the Republican Party had gone way too far already. And they're not leaving it yet. They're just complaining about it amongst themselves. They're still campaigning for it. They're still calling themselves Republicans, but they're beginning to articulate a vision of the country that looks much more like Lincoln's did than like the Republicans who were in power at the time. And these are going to be people who become progressives, people like Fighting Bob La Follette, people like Teddy Roosevelt, and most especially people like Henry Cabot Lodge, who is a name we tend to think of less than the other two, but he was a senior partner in all this. There's also Albert Beveridge out in Indiana who begins to talk about a new kind of ideology for America. And what he says is, sure, that old guard is right. You know, America's great. It's the best ever, right? But if it's really that great, we got to make sure its own citizens are also great. And if you're going to start talking about how great America is, and even take that overseas, you sure better be looking out for people at home. And Teddy Roosevelt begins to embrace that idea too. If you're gonna be strong as a nation, you're gonna be the best nation in the world, you're gonna be the greatest nation on earth, terrific, spread it overseas, but make sure you start at home. And one of the things that Teddy Roosevelt gets very upset about by the end of the 19th century is how people don't seem to be getting behind this idea of being strong and taking care of your people and being good with, producing good citizens and educating them and taking care of them in the cities and all that. And he says, you know what? This mercenary spirit is way too deep in American society. And one of the places that we could get it back is by fighting for home and humanity and family and women and children right there in Cuba, right nearby. And he actually stands up at a dinner at the Gridiron Club in Washington, D.C., which is the press club that used to hold a roast of the Gridiron Club. They roasted politicians on spits, not once a year the way we do it now, but rather periodically they'd have dinners. And William Howard Taft hated it more than anything on earth. If Xanax had been invented then, he would have popped it before he went into that room. He hated them so much. But, okay, is that better? So he actually stands up at that Gridiron dinner, and Mark Hanna is there, and he represents the industrialist wing of the party, and he says, we're never going to war in Cuba because it's full of sugar and we need that sugar, and we want the Spanish to win because we need that sugar produced. And Teddy Roosevelt stands up and he shakes his fist at Mark Hanna. Of course, this makes it into a memoir, and says, we will have this war for the freedom of Cuba in spite of the timidity of the commercial interests. And in fact, big business does not want the war in Cuba at all. It likes the status quo in Cuba. But as long as we're in Cuba, they're quite happy with the war in the Philippines, which is going to yield yet more American sugar. And here is an image from 1898 of Uncle Sam taking sugar plums. And that's not simply Cuba and not simply going to be the Philippines, but also, of course, Hawaii, which we take at about the same time. Those are all sugar producers. So big business gets behind the sugar idea, but there is that progressive idea within this imperialism that if you're gonna prove to the world you're so great, you better be great at home too. It's a powerful enough message that the people who run the Republican Party need it to stop. More and more people are building behind this idea. More and more people are getting angry at the robber barons who are running the Republican Party. They need to make this problem go away. So where do you put problems that need to go away? In the vice presidential slot. The vice presidency is where politicians go to die in the 19th century. And so what do? They convince Teddy Roosevelt to take a seat at the table, is what they tell him. But really, they're planning to silence him. And he basically barely bothers to show up in Washington for the inauguration. He doesn't even get a hotel room. He stays with a friend, and then he goes off again. And he gets so bored that he actually asks if it would be okay if he went back to law school. And Melville Fuller is so upset. He's like, I'll supervise you myself. But the idea here is that it looks, for all intents and purposes, in 1890, 1893, 1894, that the Gilded Age is here to stay. That a few rich guys are going to run everything. They've gamed the system. They've stolen a presidential seat. They've changed the mechanics so that you can't possibly ever take the Senate again. They've gamed the census so that they're doing all the counting. And then when even still it looks bad, they've packed the Supreme Court for eternity. And the Supreme Court is handing down idiotic decisions, all of which have either been overturned or modified since then. The reason you don't remember them is that basically the only thing that's still hanging out there are the insular cases, if anybody here's a lawyer. So it looks like it's time for everyone to pack up and go home. And yet, and they've even found a way to stifle a political expression, and yet, of course, a trick of fate, and I really did not set this up to sound like I was in favor of this, because I'm not. Leon Czolgosz shoots President McKinley in 1901, and he dies on September 14th. What that does, of course, is that it doesn't change Congress, it doesn't change the Supreme Court, it doesn't change the census, but what it does is it changes who's in charge of American society. And Teddy Roosevelt writes to his friend Cabot Lodge and says, it is a dreadful thing, it's such a Teddy Roosevelt thing to say, right? It's a dreadful thing to come into the presidency in this way, but it would be a far worse thing to be morbid about it. Well, I don't think that the lesson here is that assassination is the answer, because I am being taped, and I will say I am always on the record as saying assassination is never the answer. Violence is never the answer. But what Teddy Roosevelt does, and what he manages to articulate, is all those voices that had been protesting for so long and had not been able to make much headway until they got a voice somewhere in government. And once that voice was there, by the way, Teddy Roosevelt is largely ineffectual except by executive order. Everything he tries to do, they shoot down in the Senate. He gets madder and madder and madder, which is why by 1912 he is, a swashbuckling pirate trying to, standing at Armageddon and battling for the Lord because he's so pissed off at the robber barons. But what he does is he unleashes these popular forces that have been building really since the 1870s, saying, no, we are not turning this country over to an oligarchy. And I would suggest that you might have seen some parallels between this material and the present. I would suggest that for all that the 1890s and the Gilded Age tends to look to us today as a period of, oppression and of great business growth, but not necessarily a time when our government actually reflected the wishes of the American people. The tucked within that were the seeds of a new birth of democracy, a new birth of the concept that everybody should have a say in their society, and that within the oligarchy's very overreach lay the seeds of its own overturning. Thank you very much. And I think I have 10 minutes if anybody wants all the juicy stories that I could not tell.
I thought your talk was fantastic. I loved it. It seems to me from what I'm hearing that the industrialists were really not the problem. They were a symptom of the problem. The problem was that the government was the problem because it was in a position to do favors. Do you agree or disagree with that? What he said is the problem is the government because it was in a position to do favors. So I have a two-part answer. I'll give you the short answer. The first is that every government is always in a position to do favors. The very nature of government not doing something or doing something creates favors. And this is where people like Adam Smith trip terribly, is because they talk about activism as being favors. And in fact, the existence of four of us getting together to do anything means somebody's getting a favor. And if we don't get together, that means somebody's getting a favor. So that is there by definition. But what you have raised is, to me, the central and most interesting question of my work these days, which has nothing really to do with this. But I think it's really interesting. And that's that, I got into this because I wanted to know how people who had, many years ago, by the way, how people who had given their lives for the Civil War within a generation were giving everything to the very rich. And literally, Republicans in Congress during the Civil War give their sons. Their sons die for this cause. And within 10 years, they're making sure that Andrew Carnegie's making bank. And I couldn't get my head around that. And what I have come to believe, and feel free to push back, is that as these favors accumulated, the people at the top started to think they belonged there, that they really were a little bit better than everybody else, maybe a lot better. And gradually the media came to suggest that, the puff pieces and all that. And pretty soon ministers started to talk the same way. If you just worked harder, you too could be one of these guys. And then books started to do it. And then they started to believe it. And then there were textbooks that came out and said, well, you know, people like William Graham Sumner's 1883, what the social classes owe each other, and the answer is nothing. You start to have academics and educational, and charts and science that says, well, yes, some people are really just better than others. And what happens is that all of society becomes this vortex around, yeah, we got makers and we got takers. And what I came to believe is that they bought their own press. So that by the 1890s, when you've got Melville Fuller pulling the crap he's pulling, he really believes that he's doing the best thing for everybody because that's just the way the world is. And that seems to me to be a much harder battle than economics or politics or society or anything. This concept that you need to step outside of what you see in order to regain things like the concept that everyone is created equal, which could itself have its own vortex, but those favors start to build. Anyway.
Most people would agree, I think, that the trusts consolidated enough power in 1890 to control the price of labor and the prices paid to farmers all across the country. It seems like a cornerstone of your theory is that if we had reverse it, if we had had free trade since 1870, the trusts wouldn't have formed. And I have trouble with that.
No, I said I don't think we really can get into the tariff issue, certainly in reflecting today compared to the way it was then. And no, as I sort of said, you know, we could talk about the tariff issue, but the Democrats' answer is not necessarily an answer either. The point is they don't really understand global trade yet at all. So it becomes a symbol, the same way the taxes become a symbol in America from the 1970s to, you know, the 2000 aughts. It's a symbol. Most people don't understand tariff policy at all.
Because I thought that, you know, the changes in technology and concentration of the railroads and steel and coal is sort of parallel to the situation today. And I think that was really, you know, the cornerstone that formed the trust was more domestically propagated than internationally, just because of changes in technology and the economy. Anyway.
Thank you.
Thank you.